Shaheen.
Thank you. I'm pleased that we are looking at a diplomatic presence in Venezuela in the near future. I think that's very important. But the DEA has reportedly identified Delcy Rodriguez as a significant actor in the drug trade. Do you agree with that? And if you do, how are we to assure the American people that the money that's going to Venezuela is not going to any of the cartels or drug running?
All right, let's talk about this exchange between Senator Jean Shaheen and Secretary Rubio. Because on the surface, it sounds technical and bureaucratic. But underneath, it is a really revealing look at how this administration approaches corruption, accountability, and our alliances abroad.
Yeah, and that, well, first of all, on the first point, I would say she's not indicted the way Maduro and his wife were. So I'm not going to speculate about newspaper articles and what law enforcement is working on. If, in fact, there were such an investigation, that's something that we would speculate on. Suffice it to say that this was not a normal system. We all should stipulate to that, okay? That regime, as everyone understood, was held together by corruption. The glue that kept people together was not loyalty to Maduro. It was the fact that these 5 guys had 5 separate oil fields that were assigned to them. These people had drug routes.
I understand that.
So that's going to be
I'm not defending the regime. In fact, I'm concerned that we haven't really changed the regime enough and that America's dollars are still going to drug runners and to significant organizations who we don't want to have benefit from the funding that we're selling now of oil and providing to the Venezuelan government.
Look, I acknowledge that we are dealing with, I told you, with individuals that have been involved in things that in our system would not be acceptable, would not be acceptable to us in the long term. By no means is our policy to leave in place something permanent that's as corrupt as you've described. We are in the transition and stabilization phase. We are just acknowledging reality, and that is you have to work with the people that are in charge of the elements of government.
Okay, but
now, what are the
reassure people that money is not continuing to go to the drug cartels?
Right. So that's the process that I outlined to you. So on the sanctioned oil, the oil that requires U.S. permission to move, that oil, the proceeds of that oil, which, by the way, is being sold at market price, not at the discount Venezuela was being forced to sell, is being deposited into an account that ultimately will become a U.S. Treasury blocked account here in the United States. They will submit, we will, at the front end, say this is what this money can be spent on these things. We will submit to them, they will submit to us a budget request. We want to use this money for these things. And part of the proceeds will go to fund a audit process to make sure that that's how the money is being spent. So and that's how we intend to handle those funds in the short term.
There's an actual audit process that's been set up? It
will be set up, and we have a couple options. One option is the XM Bank. They have expertise as bankers in being able to do some of that option. There may be some others in place. We haven't finalized what that audit process would be. We've only made one payment. And that payment we did, and retrospectively will be audited. But it was important we made that payment because they had to meet payroll. They had to keep sanitation workers, police officers, government workers on staff. It was a $300 million payment.
Right. So it's been reported that the oil sold for $500 million, that $300 million went to Venezuelan government. What happened to the other $200 million?
It's still sitting in the account, is my understanding at this time.
The account in Qatar?
Well, the account, yes, but that will ultimately be that's a short-term account. Ultimately, it will be a U.S. Treasury blocked account in the United States.
And will it also be audited?
Correct. Well, the audit will be on the expenditures. At the front end, we'll tell them this is what the money can be spent on. Again, I'm not talking about all the other revenues the Venezuelan government may have. We're talking about the revenues from the sanctioned oil. At the front end, we will say this is what the allowable expenses are. And then they will agree to fund, as part of the overall cost, they will pay for and fund an audit system acceptable to us to ensure that that's how the money was spent.
And can you report to this committee once that audit system is set up?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I'd like to change the topic in my short time that I have left, because when you were a member of this committee, you authored legislation to prevent President Trump from unilaterally leaving NATO, you and Senator Kaine. Do you still believe that the U.S. benefits from NATO?
We do. I mean, but NATO needs to be reimagined as well in terms of the obligations. And this is not new to this president. Multiple presidents have complained about it.
I
think this president just complains about it louder than other presidents.
Well, I'm just trying to be get a clear answer on where this administration stands relative to NATO, because it's been a very fuzzy message over the last year. And do you agree that we're stronger in confronting China when we do so with like-minded partners, and that China is still the number one threat that we face in the United States.
Yeah, but our like-minded partners have to have capability, and that's been part of the problem, is the erosion in European defense capabilities, because they've taken vast amount of the monies that these are rich countries, and because of the NATO umbrella, it gave them the flexibility to spend a tremendous amount of their revenues on social programs and not on defense. Now, maybe that trend line will begin to change.
Well, it's already begun to change, frankly, and thanks. And I think the president deserves credit for that, for the fact that there is now a commitment for 5% of GDP to be spent on defense. But part of that strength also comes not just from having the mechanism, the military might, but it also comes from the unity with our allies. And to the extent to which that unity is undermined, like the talk about Greenland and antagonizing Denmark, then it undermines NATO's ability. And the only people who are excited about that are Vladimir Putin and President Xi.
Yeah, well, I would say that I think our alliances in NATO ultimately are something that's going to work out. Our partners understand the importance of the U.S. presence in NATO. Without the U.S., there is no NATO. And we understand that in order for NATO to be stronger, our partners need to be stronger. And one of the things we've explained to our allies in NATO is the United States is not simply focused on Europe. We also have defense needs in the Western Hemisphere. We have defense needs in the Indo-Pacific. And it will require us. We may be the richest country in the world, but we don't have unlimited resources. And as we reassign
exactly why we want to have allies and partners to help us as we're looking at conflicts around the world. And when we antagonize our allies and partners, and when we send Canada to do a trade deal with China instead of coming to New Hampshire or the United States, it weakens our ability to confront our adversaries.
Yeah, but our allies have to be two things. They have to be willing to step up, but they also have to be capable of stepping up. And frankly, many of them have not. I mean, Spain is still not doing the 5%. I mean, there are countries that are still not doing. And in fact, Mark Rutte yesterday pointed out that if without the United States, the countries of Europe would have to spend 10% of their GDP for the next 20 years to be able to make up the whole. So I do think there needs to be a rebalancing, and hopefully we'll have cooperation. I think we will. Rutte has done a great job of managing all.
And I'm not arguing that point with you. As I said, I agree with what the president has asked of our European allies. What I'm arguing with you about is that his rhetoric is undermining NATO and our partnership.
This was one of those hearings where the questions were polite. The tone was measured, but the implications were huge. Venezuela, corruption, and trust us, we've got an audit coming. Shaheen opens with what should be a pretty basic question. She says, look, I'm glad we're talking about restoring a diplomatic presence in Venezuela, but the DEA has reportedly identified Delcy Rodriguez as a significant player in the drug trade. So how exactly are we supposed to assure the American people that U.S.-approved oil money isn't flowing straight into the hands of drug cartels? That's not a radical question. That's not partisan. That's oversight. Rubio's first move is to narrow the scope immediately. He says Rodriguez hasn't been indicted, unlike Maduro and his wife, and he doesn't want to speculate about newspaper articles or ongoing investigations. That's Washington speak for I'm not touching that. But then, and this is important, he admits something that kind of blows the whole thing open. He says, yeah, this wasn't a normal system. The Venezuelan regime was held together by corruption. Loyalty didn't matter. Control over oil fields and drugs did. That's not Shaheen saying it. That's Rubio. And Shaheen jumps right in. She's basically saying, exactly. That's my point. If corruption is the glue holding this regime together, why should we believe that American dollars, filtered through oil sales, aren't still propping up the same corrupt networks? Rubio tries to thread a very fine needle here. He says the policy is not to leave a corrupt system in place permanently, that this is a transition and stabilization phase, and that sometimes you have to work with the people who are currently in charge. And look, that argument isn't crazy. Diplomacy is messy. Foreign policy isn't a purity test. But the problem is, trusting corrupt actors while promising accountability later is how corruption survives. Shaheen presses for specifics, and this is where things start to feel shaky. Rubio explains that oil sold under U.S. sanctions is sold at market price, and the proceeds are deposited into an account that will eventually become a U.S. Treasury blocked account. The U.S. will decide what the money can be spent on. Venezuela submits budget requests, and part of the proceeds will fund an audit process. Sounds reassuring, until you realize most of this is future tense. Shaheen asks, who's doing the audit? Rubio says, well, maybe the EXIM bank, maybe someone else. It hasn't been finalized yet. That's not great. Then we find out only one payment has been made so far, $300 million, because Venezuela needed to make payroll. Sanitation workers, police officers, government staff. Again, understandable. But then Shaheen drops the key follow-up. The oil reportedly sold for $500 million. Where did the other $200 million go? Rubio says it's still sitting in the account. It'll eventually be transferred. It'll be audited. Eventually, will be going to. This is the pattern. Everything depends on systems that are not fully built yet, audits that are not fully set up yet, safeguards that are promised but not operational. And Shaheen does what lawmakers are supposed to do. She asks for accountability. She asks Rubio to report back to the committee once the audit system is actually in place. Rubio agrees, and honestly, that might be the most important moment in this whole exchange, because without sustained oversight, these promises mean nothing. Then Shaheen pivots, and this pivot matters. She reminds Rubio that when he was in the Senate, he co-authored legislation, along with Senator Tim Kaine, to prevent President Trump from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO. And she asks the obvious question, do you still believe the U.S. benefits from NATO? Rubio says yes, but then adds that NATO needs to be reimagined, particularly around burden sharing. He argues that European countries have underinvested in defense because the NATO umbrella allowed them to spend on social programs instead. This is where the conversation gets really revealing. Shaheen agrees that allies should contribute more. She even credits the president for pushing defense spending up to 5% of GDP. But she makes the crucial point. Strength doesn't just come from tanks and budgets, it comes from unity. And when the administration talks about Greenland, antagonizes Denmark, or sends mixed signals about alliances, it undermines that unity. And she says something that should not be controversial, but somehow is. The only people who benefit from weakened NATO unity are Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. That's the heart of it. Rubio responds by emphasizing capability. Allies have to be willing and able. He points out that some countries still aren't meeting spending targets. He argues that without the U.S., Europe would have to massively increase defense spending just to keep up. All of that can be true, and still miss the point. Shaheen isn't arguing against burden sharing. She's arguing against rhetoric that actively weakens alliances at a time when authoritarian powers are testing the global order. And she says it plainly at the end. The president's rhetoric is undermining NATO and our partnerships, and that's a problem. She's not yelling, she's not grandstanding, she's stating a strategic reality. What makes this exchange so important is that it exposes a deeper tension in U.S. foreign policy right now. On Venezuela, the administration is saying, we know this system is corrupt, but trust us, we'll manage it. On NATO, the message is, we value alliances, but we're going to publicly pressure and antagonize them until they meet our demands. In both cases, the theory is that America can control the outcome through leverage alone, through money, through pressure, through dominance. But history tells us something else. Corruption doesn't disappear because you promise to audit it later. It disappears when transparency and accountability are built into the system from the start. When you send hundreds of millions of dollars into a fragile, corrupt environment and say, don't worry, we'll check later. You're not reassuring people, you're asking for blind faith. And alliances don't get stronger when they're treated like grudging obligations. They get stronger when there's trust, consistency, and mutual respect. Yes, allies should contribute more. Yes, defense spending matters, but unity is not a side effect, it's a strategic asset. Shaheen understood that. That's why her questions mattered. She wasn't attacking for the sake of attacking. She was doing the unglamorous work of oversight, asking where the money goes, who's watching it, and whether U.S. actions are making us safer or just louder. Rubio, to his credit, acknowledged many of the problems. He didn't deny the corruption. He didn't deny the risks. But acknowledgement without concrete safeguards is not enough. Promises without timelines are not enough. And alliances without careful stewardship are fragile. At a moment when authoritarian regimes are watching every crack in the democratic world, the U.S. cannot afford sloppiness, financial or rhetorical. We can't assume our power will paper over bad systems or bruised relationships. This exchange wasn't about Venezuela alone. It wasn't about NATO alone. It was about whether U.S. foreign policy is grounded in accountability, humility, and long-term strategy, or whether it's drifting toward improvisation and after-the-fact fixes. And if there's one thing we should all agree on, regardless of party, it's this. American credibility is one of our most valuable assets. Once it's spent, it's very hard to earn back. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more deep dives like this, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think these safeguards are enough? Are alliances being strengthened or strained? Let's talk about it.